Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the next in our series of Grand Challenge lecture series. We're very pleased to welcome Professor Steve Hinchliffe. Some of you will know Professor Hinchliffe. He was a lecturer in geography at Keele between 1994 and 1997, so it's a real pleasure to welcome you back, and I know you've already had a chance to acquaint yourself or reacquaint yourself with some older colleagues here. So Professor Hunchliffe is currently Professor of Human Geography at the College of Life and Environmental Sciences at the University of Exeter. He's an elected Fellow of the Academy of Social Sciences and author and editor of numerous books and articles on issues ranging from risk, food security, biosecurity, human, non-human relations and nature conservation. So that should whet the appetite in terms of an interdisciplinary challenge if there ever was one. He's committed to using spatial and social science understanding in issues of public and environmental interest. Steve is an appointed member of the Social Sciences Research Committee of the Food Standards Agency and has been appointed to DEFRA's Science Advisory Council Social Science Expert Group. He's received funding in the past from DEFRA, the EU, ESRC and many other funding organisations. Today's Steve's talk is entitled Pathological Lives on the Cosmopolitics of Losing Self-Assurance, and he's going to enlighten us on that in just a while. His introduction says that pathogenic microbes threaten progress in global health, something that we're all very familiar with as a very contemporary topic in the news at the moment. They compromise food security, global food security, and they feed a looming sense of a very uncertain future that we all face. Steve considers these threats today and challenges and will offer insights into how we can live for better or for worse with microbes and offer a cosmopolitical approach where pathological lives are not so much the problem but a part of the solution. So welcome to our lunchtime Grand Challenges lecture series today, Professor Steve Hinchliffe.
Thank you, and thank you to everyone for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here and lovely to hear about the Institute and be here near the start of it. And I think it's a fantastic institute and plays to Keele's traditional strengths of liberal arts and kind of co-teaching with across the disciplines, which I think is really great. I should say the book that has got the similar title to this is just out with Wiley, and I think I promised way too much in an abstract as usual, and given the time I won't be able to go through very much, but if you really want to look at it in more detail, then the book's the place to go. But let me just start with three quick things about where this work comes from. First of all, the work emerges from a long period of doing mainly ethnography, I should say, on farms, in laboratories, on wildlife reserves, working alongside epidemiologists, microbiologists, wildlife conservationists and so on, and learning from colleagues also in philosophy, in Egenis at Exeter, and so on. So there's an awful lot of background to this, which I won't be able to give you a kind of detailed sense of the methods and the kind of and the nitty-gritty of it. In fact, some of what I'm going to do is sort of almost postcards from the field, I guess, is how I'm going to start to give you a sort of flavour of some of the things that I've been, and with colleagues, been finding out over the last few years. Secondly, in the tradition that's being built on here, this is, I hope, interdisciplinary work. And it stems, I suppose, from the realisation, and I'm working increasingly with colleagues in biological sciences, and we're just off to Bangladesh to look at antimicrobial resistance in aquaculture there at the end of the week. But I'm increasingly struck, I think, and I'm not the only one, of course, that thinking in biological sciences is closer than might be presumed for a social scientist like me to our commitments to what Mick Dillon calls the anteriority of radical relationality, a kind of way of thinking that everything in some ways emerges from its relations. So in some ways the biosciences and the social sciences share an ontology or a way of thinking about the world, not necessarily sharing a politics of knowledge, and perhaps that's where some of this work is pointing to. But there is a shared commitment there that I think is really worth building on, and I hope that comes out through the talk. Finally, for those who are interested, this work stems from a long interest I've had in how life and politics become intricate, become related together, as Foucault would put it. And probably a dissatisfaction, if I could put it probably too boldly, with the tendency to either naively celebrate the promiscuity or fecundity of life and its ability not to be, or its inability to be captured, and then on the other side, to chart the continually emerging and grasping nature of biopolitics that seems inevitably to result in a reduction of all but a few proper lives, the small minority and a tiny subpart of some humans, the normative core. So I'm dissatisfied with that kind of voluntarism on one side, if you like, of life and kind of the flourishing of life, and on the other side, a kind of version of biopolitics that seems to be constantly about grasping more and more of that life and making it work at the lathe of production. My hope is that interdisciplinarity and interdisciplinary work can find out ways of coupling or can find ways out of the coupling of that voluntarism and or determinism that on my reading infects so much biopolitics. The subtitle then conjures instead the cosmopolitical commitment to counter-norms, to working in a different key. Now that all might sound rather abstract to some of you, and I'm sure it is, but hopefully it'll make some sense as I go on. But let me start with something a little more empirical. So, 2 years ago, this is a statement from the WHO, and largely what I'm going to be talking about is avian influenza, which is quite live at the moment, as you know, in Europe and in China. That statement, the diversity and geographical distribution of influenza viruses currently circulating in wild and domestic birds are unprecedented since the advent of modern tools for virus detection and characterization. The world needs to be concerned, and of course that concern is probably reaching something of a height in Europe with H5N8 circulating around, something over 1,000 outbreaks and 500,000 cases in domestic poultry, waterfowl and wild birds as we speak. That's in the last few months. And then also another variant, subtype H7N9, which seems to be developing a resistance to antivirals in China, and there's some concern about the underreporting of this case as it transfers and transmits into the human population. But if you add in the current situation, H5N1 still circulating, endemic in Egypt and other places, H7N9, as I've said, H5N8, H5N2, etc., H5NX, as virologists start to talk about it now, you start to get what Laurie Garrett called an alphabet soup of avian influenza viruses circulating. So that's one concern, and one way of talking about this concern, if you like, is the diversity and geographical distribution of those influenza viruses. There seem to be more about, and that's the way of thinking about concern. But there's two other ways of thinking about the concern. The second one, as is intimated here, or is this simply a matter of measurement? Is this simply about new techniques, new whole genome sequencing and so on? And that sense that everything is everywhere, and certainly when I work at the Food Standards Agency, thinking of Horsegate here, the more you look, the more you find whatever you're looking for in kind of the food we eat, the environment and so on. Everything is everywhere in that sense. But thirdly, and this was the third possibility that I think was eerily absent from this document, and epidemiologists in the room will know very well, is that there's not much here on the need to be concerned, not so much about the viruses themselves, but rather the conditions that make them, and worse, give them their pathogenicity. To take the 80-year-old Bas-Becking precept that biogeographers have talked about for a number of years, but microbiologists are starting to use, everything is everywhere, but the environment selects. Everything is everywhere, but the environment. It's the environment that selects. Might we focus then, and this is the purpose, I guess, of this work and this book and what I'm going to talk about today, might we focus less on the bugs themselves, but rather on the host, the environment, and the microbe interactions as matters for concern, and start to think about this alphabet soup of viruses in rather different ways. The question for the paper then becomes how best to deal with the microbial surplus that these kinds of statements start talking about. So, overview of the talk. I'm going to do three things, two of them in a bit of detail, one, the end, disappointingly brief, I suspect. But first of all, quick responses to microbiological surplus, and I will talk about two onto stories, as my old colleague from Keele, John Law, talked about them. Onto stories and the kind of performative stories that perform the world. First one about purity, and the second one about the permanent emergency as these circulate within various institutions. Secondly, I'm going to talk about changing biosocialities, and because we're in the Chinese year of the rooster, this is actually the year of the chicken, and also talk a little bit about microbial life and some kind of key ideas, especially about viral life. And then thirdly, some conclusions around One Health and a different commons, which well, maybe we can pick up some of those in questions. So getting on to, and this is some of the postcards now. Let me start with one of my favourite images. It's actually from 1927. On the right here is Trumpland or La La Land, depending on how you see it. There's a nice wall there, and it's kind of public health, obviously. First time I showed this, I hadn't actually looked at it carefully enough. There is an animal on this side, but you can see in kind of classic sense he's on two legs, how he's tail docked and so on. So for those that know Donna Haraway, your heart out. It's also white, obviously. So there's a kind of there's a racial politics to this. So this Onto story about public health is, of course, it's partly about purification, and public health is partly performed here as keeping things at bay. There's a long history that I won't go into, a well-told story, of course, of quarantine, segregation, exclusion, as well as versions of regulation. The differential exclusion, then, of some improper lives and the disciplined inclusion of proper lives, so that the dog becomes a two-legged dog and so on, has been well told. And, of course, if you want to hear that story again, then read Michel Foucault and others. We should note, of course, that historically this diagramming, this way in which the world is diagrammed into proper and improper lives, occurred at the same time with the rise of Homo economicus, liberalism, and increased circulation. The result then is not really just a wall, it's actually a set of translations of geographic mobilities from, as Angela Metropolis calls it, from contact, movement, and communication, in kind of sort of ways of being, ways of living really, contact, movement and communication, were tidied up into the much tidier and regulated exchange, circulation and commerce. Okay, so contact becomes exchange, movement becomes circulation, communication becomes commerce. So that's a way of thinking about evermore the spaces of circulation, if you like, that are involved. So this world is not just about borders, and walls, of course, don't just define borders. They're also crossing points, and you get more and more circulation in a kind of liberal economy, and those needed to be tidied up. That kind of movement needs to be tidied up. So that's the first little postcard from thinking about these kinds of things. The second one, model production. Model farms are virtuous spaces, like airports. In fact, I was very surprised. I had to show my passport going into some of these farms. And in China, we get a translation from yellow to white meat production as a kind of solution to some of the disease scares I talked about. In Egypt, where we did some work over 10 years ago on avian influenza, a lot of production has moved out to desert spaces in order to perform what's called biosecurity. These model farms also perform vertically integrated value supply chains, a walling out and a regulated movement. Again, a pasteurized world, you could say, following sociologist of science Bruna Latour, where the local vet and farmer become small and the scientist in her lab becomes large, hence the photograph. Or actually, the industry surveys the scene. This is someone from the Marks and Spencer's analytics team surveying the scene of a model farm trying to deal with some of the disease threats that we've talked about. This is One Health, then, as one world or biosecurity. It's about power, knowledge, a power over the solution, if you like, to the problems that we started with, are part and parcel of this kind of walling off of life. And if you want your free-range eggs, you'll know that that's kind of part of the problem at the moment, in the sense that the idea of free-ranging poultry is becoming difficult in the current outbreak. Another postcard then about these kinds of things which sort of fit in, and you can take any number of these maps, and I'm not picking on any one in particular or any two, as you'll see. But these kinds of maps thinking about the kind of movement of disease, and in this case this is about flights and cities, and speaking of a small and interconnected world of hypermobility, a world of rapid high volume, and as Stephen Morse called it many years ago, viral traffic. All the weapons, you could say, of contingency, of non-virtuosity, are lined up to infect the virtuous core here. And you can see that Western Europe and the kind of seaboards of the US are kind of where the big red dots are, as where the threat from movement of disease comes. It's worth dwelling for a second on two things, to notice something else beyond this out of Asia narrative. You could take other diseases to do an out of Africa narrative, of course, but two things that these maps perform, or these onto stories perform, I think is important to notice. First of all, they emphasize what Lindsay Thomas called the easy, smooth transmission of microbes, goods and people across various borders, smoothing over, in her terms, local disconnection, friction and delays to create easy to digest maps of infection. Two things then. Spatially, this is a geometrics of microbial extension of travelling from A to B over space. It's about reach, and the response is a prophylactics of walls, antibiotics and hygiene. It's also a version of space that is already there. Now, to geographers in the room, you may know that I find that particularly problematic. This is pre-existing space pre-existing the social and material relations, which for many of us in geography, relational thinking would say space comes out of those relations rather than vice versa. In terms of disease, the focus is almost entirely on the pathogenic agents, on microbes as threats to health, i.e. a healthy world threatened by the contingencies of the wild or the interspecies intimacy of the Orient and the promiscuity of mobile bodies or mobile vectors. The normal and the pathological then are troped as Euro, America and the rest, and ag-tech versus wild and under-domesticated life in these kinds of stories. Recent studies of the epizootic that occurred in the US, H5N2 and H5N8, has looked at wild bird movements as the vectors of these the viruses and so on, and kind of overturned some ideas about the kind of interrelation of wild populations and so on. But again, the maps are similar in that sense. You have the kind of transmission of or vector transmission of bugs over space, and that becomes the kind of narrative of how to control disease. This is, again, the answer to this is to wall out these kinds of problematic lives. And finally, my final postcard for just this opening section on thinking about purity in particular is one of my favourites that they wouldn't let me use in the book, so I kind of use it at any opportunity when I'm not being watched by anyone, copyright, from, in this case, a pig breeder. I like to think of this as an immaculate conception, or baconception if you want, of kind of the biosecure pig, usually grown in Canada, maybe in Ireland, then circulated onto farms in order to kind of replace genetic stock and so on. I won't go into the details for the moment, but it's not just, as I hinted earlier, biosecurity and thinking about purity is not just about keeping stuff out, but also a redoing of movement into circulation, exchange, and so on, how to make life circulate and circulate well. This is the immaculate conception then of the biosecure pig, the specific pathogen-free SPF pig, a sort of theological figure, I think, if you think of it there, being gifted a host with no specific pathogens. As Emily Yates-Durr, an anthropologist, puts it, this is biosecurity as the infrastructure through which safe travel is orchestrated. So biosecurity is very much that kind of continuing to exchange, but to do it safely. Now I'm going to return at the end to these pigs for another bad joke. There's a twist in their tail, which we'll see at the end of my talk. Right. So that's one story about purity. Okay. The other one that's probably noticeable from the literature is the permanent emergency. And Bruce Braun, about 10 years ago in Cultural Geographies, wrote a wonderful paper on this, which I'll just two highlights from all this. So on top of all the geographing of the world in terms of the orchestration of safe life, there is this other onto story. Life has become told as rather unwieldy and dangerous to itself. 10 years ago, Bruce's essay traced out the stakes and noted with lots of others how the emergency of the emergent seemed to generate a newfound or rebooted will to power or sovereign form of power. We live in a global economy of exchange and circulation where the body is thrown into a chaotic and unpredictable molecular world filled with emergent yet unspecifiable risks. And emergence becomes a justification then of the global extension of forms of sovereign power whose purpose is to preempt certain biological futures in favour of others. And some of the diagrams or pictures you just saw is that kind of favouring certain lives over others. Why do I keep going for that? Well, if you want more detail on the social sciences, some of the best places to go to are political theory and philosophy, people like Mick Dillon. The Biopolitical Project for Dillon is the making, or for Dillon and Reid in this case, the Making Life Live has arrived at an interpretation of life, and just wanted to highlight, as an informationally driven, contingently adaptive process of complex emergence. Okay, so if you go back 50 years or so, viruses and bacteria really weren't considered to be very dynamic. In fact, they were regarded as probably going to kind of burn themselves out in time. But now we've got that sense of life, not all life, including epigenetics and so on, as becoming contingently adaptive processes, which is interesting. And if you do that, if you tell that story, which is a good story, I'm not saying it's socially constructed or anything, there's an awful lot to it, but life that is always becoming is also life that is readily construed as becoming dangerous. So that's where some of this story comes from. And the continuing extraction of surplus is combined with an everywhere war to emancipate such a life from becoming dangerous to itself. And we end up, I suppose, and this is a bit unkind to Dillon, but there's an element of the certain parts of biopolitics. I think Dillon's one of the best people in this area, but you sometimes end up, and you can quote him on this in the page that I've got used for this particular talk, is a kind of necropolitics, or a politics of death in the age of life as information. And the subtitle of the book, this is about killing to make life live. So that's kind of the selecting out, and there's a history in philosophy from Agamben and thinking about the kind of difference between bios and zoe and so on, the demarcation of life worth living as being not just in human politics but also in animal politics. Now, these are compelling onto stories, okay? But I want to juxtapose these with practices of making life live, so a little bit more empirical work from the kind of things we're doing. Demonstrating, and I want to demonstrate not only the paradoxes of the wall that I talked about at the start, but also the emerging biosocialities that offer maybe some kind of hope, and that's when I come back to the pigs. But most of the time I'm going to be talking about chickens. So let's talk about, that's the age of life as necropolitics, or politics of death in the age of life as information. Driven by that contingently adaptive process, we end up making decisions over life and death. So, let me get on to chickens then. Well, this is the year of the chicken, or the rooster in the Chinese New Year, but it's also the year of the chicken in the sense that 2017, poultry overtakes pigs as the largest mass of meat produced globally. Okay, you can see some of the figures there. In 2017, we expect 119 million tons of poultry meat globally. 94 million tons of that is chicken. The rest is ducks and geese, turkeys as well. And that equates, if my calculations are right, to around 65 billion poultry per year, 52 billion chickens produced every year. Human numbers, as we know, are rising at 1.2% a year. Livestock numbers are roughly double that, 2.4% a year. Now, in the book, Pathological Lives, we wanted to think about and challenge the conventional story, and I've certainly been on platforms where these people have been around, the virus hunters who will go into parts of Asia and certainly into parts of Africa and post-AIDS will look for the new and emergent viruses that are kind of spilling over, if you like, from wildlife into human populations, so that transmission route is kind of interesting. But what I wanted to do in this book and think about more generally is the issue may no longer be the encroachment of people into wild spaces, but quite the reverse, the increasingly obvious encroachment of non-human animal ecologies, like the poultry ecologies, on to people. So what is going on with this addition of biomass to the planet, and how does that change that host-environment microbe interaction? So, like many other people, we did some work starting in Egypt and then more recently in the UK and a little bit in China on kind of what it means to do poultry in the way that's regarded as biosecure. And it's an obvious list, but on the left, just making a profit, what are some of the things that are required in these kinds of houses? High stocking rates, high volume, rapid growth weights, low stock diversity, and of course great history to the chicken as becoming a staple part of the protein-demanding diet of the world in these cases, systematic use of nutritional and pharmaceutical supplements, antibiotics as growth promoters, not in Europe but elsewhere, and metaphylactics. the use of antibiotics in warding off the chance of a group disease. Application of logistics and vertical integration. So in this country, supermarkets have led this. In the States, the integrators themselves. And then low-level inputs and costs as well, low labour inputs and costs as well, which I'll come back to. Just one poultry vet that I went round with who clapped when we went round the poultry shed that we were in, and every bird around us defecated, and then said, the modern bird is very close to diarrhea, shall we say. You're growing a 2.5 kilo bird in 38 or 39 days. Imagine that, from 1 day old chicks put down on a farm. 38 days later, you've got a 2.5 kilo bird, which used to take, even 10 years ago, would have been 5 days longer. And of course, we will see a diagram in a moment of how that's changed. It's well known. Surplus labour then, I suppose, if I'm being a Marxist about it, is extracted from more chickens in less time, and the results are what one biologist we interviewed said was a highly immunocompromised animal ripe for viral shedding. Birds grown for 35 days in sheds of 30,000, starved, then thinned down, and then harvested, as it's called, produce a sociobiology where guts are flooded with noradrenaline, producing biochemical changes in the gut take-up of gut microflora and virulence. And if you follow the Campylobacter issue, it's most people, Tom Humphreys, one of Sophie's colleagues, would attest, is part and parcel of that process of stressing birds in order to take up bacteria into their muscle tissue as well. So that's part of the story, very quickly. Just some other ideas, some other parts of the story. If you go follow the food chain just into the processor, an interview with one of the processors. To have 1.3 million birds in here every week, it has to be carefully calculated from a hatching perspective. How many birds are put down on the farms, which farms, just to ensure a smooth supply of poultry into the plant, because our customer, in this case Tesco's, our customer demands are such we couldn't have 1 million one week and then 1.6 the next. It has to be 1.3 every week. Another vet, they're rearing racehorses. Those birds have to go through like a race, to be honest. And if you slow down at any point, that's it. And you get the images there that are, conventional off the web of the kind of changing shape and size of the birds. So this operation is formidable in terms of production, of mass and surplus. Chickens are contracted to produce just in time, on time, at scale. Low unit costs mean big numbers, and a logistical and statistical production managed on a central database, choreographing flows of chicken through the system. High throughput farming. And of course, going back to the wall and the kind of model farm, this is hardly a closed system. This is a highly regulated high-flow system where microbiology is continually altered within the contractual landscape that requires throughput and standards to make a profit. Bird life is accelerated. They live, as we see, like racehorses. Some work we did for DEFRA on antimicrobial resistance, just to give you a sense, and I won't dwell on this. A number of farmers will tell us we can't just stop using antibiotics because it's infrastructural. Okay, antibiotics are infrastructural to some of this. It's going to be very difficult for some farmers to deal with the kind of increased morbidity and mortality that would be associated with taking your foot off some of the inputs that are part and parcel of this surplus life. So we can't just stop if it's going to lead to a falling off of chicken health and also obviously in the business margins. So poultry farmers are significantly worried about that. And there were headlines last year about the British Poultry Council announcing that antibiotics have been reduced massively. In fact, what that was about a replacement of some older antibiotics with fluoroquinolones, which had a lower active weight, which allowed them to kind of say they were using less, but actually were using more critically important ones. So that's part of the problem. The other point, just to kind of note after that field work, is that this is also about descaling labour. And I just want to make this point, both in this country, but also more broadly, although in China, poultry farming does tend to use a lot more labour because of labour costs, but nevertheless, the chicken bodies are not the only ones whose sociobiology is conditioned in this political virology. Labour is one of the factors of production that is seldom scaled. So everything else gets scaled up. So you scale up the numbers, sizes of the chickens, everything else is scaled up, if you like, in order to have a low per unit, but a low margin, but high volume industry. But the one thing that isn't scaled up, and I could have gone to Karl Marx for this, is labour, of course. Indeed, farms typically with 300,000 birds or 500,000 chickens are largely run with one person on site, maybe 1.5 people. It's like a container ship with a minimal crew. But the thin and the catch, there are kind of moments, pinch points in this process where you do need labour. And this was the worst part of the ethnography for me, is that I followed a catching team around a number of farms for a few days, joining in, travelling with them, and moving from farm to load the large lorries with exactly 5,500 chickens each. What I learned was there was no room forever. Half-empty trucks cost money, big money, and destroy the whole kind of profitability. And chickens left at the end of the shift without a truck are just regarded as waste. We work in a team of 4 at a rate of 1,500 chickens each hour, shifts maybe overnight, and get the chicken to the processor on time at the right price point and so on. This is piecework, no sick pay, embodied and visceral labour. Hot overalls and masks are rarely used, as you can see from the image, because you're working in 25 degrees C in the darkness often. And then at processing, when subcontracted labour is brought in to move chicken bodies to market, unskilled, precarious work, again, the sociobiology is sometimes palpable. These are, we would say, critical pinch points, intense moments of production where bodies, viruses, excrement and so on don't just circulate in that kind of tidied up version of the world. They heave, move, contract and commune. There is communication again. Okay, so that's some of the sociobiology of poultry and the kind of environment-host microbe interactions. I hope you get some sort of sense of some of that. Sorry, that's just a logistical sheet that everything is really well choreographed by the process and so on. I'm realising I'm running out of time, so I'm going to tear through the next bit. The other bit I wanted to talk about was changing biosocialities. The second bit was microbial life, and I just wanted to talk very briefly about quasi-species, and maybe it's not that controversial as a kind of way of thinking. That little diagram's working, and I can talk about that in a minute. But every virologist I've spoken to accepts that viruses are not just single things all looking the same. They're swarms or developmental processes. Again, back to this relational understanding of the world, subject to drifts and shifts. They form what some call a quasi-species, a cloud of diverse variants that are genetically linked through mutation, but interact cooperatively on a functional level and collectively contribute to characteristics of the population. Now, the maths is beyond me, and that's where my interdisciplinarity gets lost. But they kind of, if you've got a sort of consensus sequence here of a virus marked by the peak, and then you run a kind of, you increase the mutation rate, which for these RNA viruses, they mutate very easily because no copy editing, etc. Then you tend to get a drift of the population into new territory. Okay, so that's just one of the aspects. There's a cloud. Some people talk about viral clouds. The anthropologist Celia Lowe does a lovely paper on viral clouds. So, swarms, mixes, clouds, a quasi-species, or, in my terms, a society whose fitness is confirmed by its difference and repetition rather than fidelity to a master copy. Okay, that's the kind of issue. For quasi-species theorists, a viral swarm is a functional network of variants, and it is this that makes a viral population viable. So the survival of the flattest in that sense. It's his identity, then, without a master copy, and a population that is rapidly adjustable depending on the intensities of its host relations. So one of the things I'm playing with here is that in those maps of viruses that kind of move along plane fights and so on, you have a kind of model of extension of disease. I'm trying to think here more about extensions, also about intention or intensities. And this is kind of coming from not only virology, but also the social science. Swarm variability and host heterogeneity provides a complex relation that affects immune escape, transmissibility, cellular tropisms, and so on, all affect issues of persistence. Now, rather idiosyncratically, I go then back to, in the book, to Gabriel Tard, who's a forerunner to Deleuze and so on. Some of you may know the work. But I'm interested in what they understand, or he understood, and then gets taken up in science studies as a process of imitation. And noticeably, some of the virus hunters that I mentioned earlier talk about viral chatter, this process of constant repetition and difference that goes on when hosts and microbes encounter each other, and there's an awful lot of kind of redundancy in that relation, but there's also a lot of chatter going on and co-formation going on. So to look at that from I suppose a social scientist aspect, although Tard was famously a polymath, this is a process of imitation then, or forming compounds that result from unstable interferences. A process, as Deleuze and Guattari went on to use it, of repetition and difference. In this sense, contagion then is not so much defilement, but a generative opportunity for learnt difference, or configuration, as some epidemiologists call it. The point very quickly I want to make is that viruses don't just diffuse or extend across space in that kind of mapping model of epidemiology. They make and are made in intensive couplings where difference and repetition count as much as touch. Okay, that's the key point. So I'm describing to you a world of intensity, I suppose, and how viruses respond to that intensity. So the maps that we draw are not those kind of smooth transitions, but much more kind of thinking about the kind of heat and the kind of the friction going on in this kind of world of exchange, a different kind of exchange and contagion. Okay. Now, one of the things we got a grant for was to look at contagion across various sciences and start to think about it. And one of the, I'm going to do this really quickly, but one of the kind of interesting thing working with avian influenza experts and virologists at the what's now the Animal Plant and Health Agency is we did a number of workshops and thought about different kinds of ways of thinking about disease. And I suppose you've got the more Newtonian molecular one on the left here, which kind of drives a lot of the methods and the things they do. But disease on that sort of sense, and this is kind of the old model, the kind of model with the walls, if you like, for me, is that the focus is on pattern, inheritance and mutability, if that kind of sort of vertical way of thinking about viral mutation. It's about pathways and phylogeny as a kind of traditional way of talking about that, and the phylogeography that comes from that. Pathogenicity is a categorical trait encoded in genes and proteins, and then the emergence of pathogens become a qualitative shift from commensal to pathogenic and a result of point mutation and so on. The answer is to do more sequencing of microbes, more whole genomic sequencing, etc. And the spatial vocabulary, as I kind of picked it up, was about disease sites, coordinates, pathways, and the extension of control, this kind of reach, this kind of sovereign power that Bruce Braun talked about. But on the other hand, there was another kind of set of stories and discourses going on that were kind of interesting, and we got a lot of agreement that these were important too, but it's kind of being able to translate from one to the other is more problematic in practice, I think. You could safely say that came out of the discussions. But here the focus is on process, evolution and selection pressures. It's about, the explanation is about the milieu. So the explanation for a disease is about its milieu, not just the phylogeny, not just the bug, if you like. Pathogenicity is a phenotypical or shared trait, a phenotypical shared trait. And as that quasi-species kind of concept would give you a hint of, the kind of migration or the shift and the drift of those of the virus, the pathogenicity is conferred by a quantitative accumulation which produces that pathogenicity. What the response should be, we agreed, was more evidence of ecological stress, and then the spatial vocabulary, and we use this in the pathological lives, is to shift from sites to situations, which I use in a particular kind of way, intensities rather than extension, precarity, spatial interaction rather than the extension of control. So, I'm getting near the end. Have I got a few minutes? 5 minutes? 2 minutes? So, let me just try and sum up what I've said. Industrial food production involves mass, okay, no surprise. It also involves biological thresholds, movement, and new selection conditions for companion opportunist organisms. Emergent life is not simply informationally driven and or linear. It is a spatial and relational process, and that's the kind of the mapping that I'm trying to get at, both in terms of the quasi-species, but also in the way the host environments are also changing. Disease events, then, the event of disease, that kind of temporal moment of shift from a kind of everything is everywhere, the environment selects. When the event of a disease occurs, they're produced through the twists and the turns of heterogeneous and relational interactions. That's the kind of point, is that everything is everywhere. It's the environment selects. What's going on to kind of produce pathological lives is not just the pathogens, if you like, and some people in nature reason there's no such thing as a pathogen. It's a relation, and how do we think about that is really important. So, a couple of quick points. Some questions. What if then, and this is probably where I'm moving to, what if life as information, that kind of, the thing that Mick Dillon kind of picked up on, and of course the new techniques in biosciences are kind of moving us towards all the time, what if life as information is actually a methodologically driven, intervention-led piece of bad metaphysics? Okay, that's probably a mouthful, but you might get a sense of what I'm talking about. If instead life is a spatial play, a matter of distributions, a dance of extensions and intensities, and I think you get this from Evo-Devo biology, evolutionary and developmental biology, as much as from kind of idiosyncratic social scientists, then, let me say what I think that involves, then the neoliberal appropriation of life as information becomes something that interdisciplinary work can contest. And I'm increasingly finding that working across the social scientists and bioscientists, to a certain extent with political theory, philosophy and so on, increasingly starts to find common ground for contesting this sense in which there's a kind of will to power, a controllability of life as information. In fact, there's something else going on that we need to, the complexities are more interesting than that. And what that means very quickly is there's a politics, Dillon and Reid I think are quite right, not only of deliberating and questioning the rules and practices of common life thus formed, but also, and this is drawing on one of, I think, the key thinkers in this area, Isabel Stengers, but we also need to think about the passing fright that scares self-assurance, and that's kind of my subtitle for this, is that I think that kind of, the WHO's we should be concerned is a passing fright that we may have things quite wrong, not to do more white meat production, more biosecurity, but to think very seriously about the kind of the contingencies and the escape, if you like, or the kind of non-reducibility of some of these life forms to our kinds of grids. So that gets me to the coda, and I promise you the twist in the tail of the pigs. Just interesting to me, I think it's here that ethnography matters, because when I went to follow the immaculate bacon conception to going onto the farm, the first thing that farmers do is tended to cover it with muck. Okay, so you've got this beautifully clean pig, but that pig isn't going to survive 5 minutes unless the farmer gets it covered in muck and builds up its immune system. Okay, so you've got specific pathogen-free pigs that are a disaster for the farm. Not only will they die very quickly because they don't get the bugs, or they're not used to the bugs on the farm, they also act as a kind of empty vessel for a kind of the multiplication of what else is on the farm, and may turn it into a pathological lives themselves. So it's kind of interesting that when you do all this kind of technical, and it goes to gene editing, work at the Roslin Institute and so on, you do all this, but then husbandry becomes vital. Okay, it's not just the scientist becomes large and the local vet and the farmer becomes small. Actually, to make this work, to make this network work, health becomes a local achievement that can involve communing, again, microbes, not excommunication. The careful management of contact, movement, and communication generates possibilities for building health. Health is not a one and for all, it's something that has to be locally enacted, patched together on the farm. Indeed, it's these farmers, and I'm hoping the similar sort of things come out from the work we're going to do now in Bangladesh, who are skilled and knowledgeable in their own way in the relations to non-humans, and indeed those who know the indeterminacy, like the virologists I talked to, the viral swarms. And it's those people, I think, some of them are currently endangered from the kind of cleaning out of, well, the EPA in America, but also the kind of agencies and so on in this country, that we need to protect in order to give us the kinds of important contextual knowledges that allow us to think again and to kind of build a different cosmopolitics of health, if you like, a different one health, which is actually always more than one, because there's always more than one way of doing it. So the conclusions, very quickly, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I realise I've gone over this very quickly, but the common sensing that I'm talking about involves paying due attention to a bewildering variety, as Isabel Stengers calls it, of what it means to be both in touch with and touched by reality, and the farmers are my kind of, my slightly romantic version of that at the moment. Cosmopolitics requires us then to create a different practical landscape, one that's not so concerned, if you like, about keeping everything out, but wondering how we actually commune better with the microbial world. Thank you.